You all have someone who has hurt you. You all have someone who has tried to harm you. But the secret to life and the secret river of which David spoke again and again was the river that let him forgive. When he was in that cave, he did not kill Saul. He brought his sword up and he brought it down again, and he cut out a big piece of Saul's cloak. And that's when he and Abishai walked out of the cave. And then an hour later, when Saul came out of the cave and looked across the valley and saw David, Saul drew his sword out and said, "David, I have found you, and now I'm going to kill you. I have 3,000 of my best soldiers with me, David, and there is no way to escape." And David looked across the little valley and shouted out to Saul, "Saul, before you kill me, look at your cloak." And Saul looked down at his cloak and he saw a big piece of it missing. And he said, "What happened to my cloak?" And then David drew out his sword and he held up the piece of the cloak that he had cut away from Saul, and he said, "Saul, a few minutes ago I stood over you when you were helpless, and I could have killed you. But instead, Saul, I forgave you, and I cut away this part of your cloak to prove to you that I had been there, and you were in my power, and I did not harm you." And Saul looked across at David, and he looked down again at his cloak, and he looked up. Something happened to Saul. And he cried across the valley, saying, "David, David, you are a better man than me. David, you have spared my life. I can see that the power of God and the Spirit of God is in you, David, and you are the rightful King of Israel, and not me." Saul put his sword back into his sheath, and he called out to his 3,000 soldiers, "Put away your weapons. Let David go." And they returned to Jerusalem and spared David's life. That moment changed everything. The moment in which the river of healing flowed past David, and he had the wisdom to drink deeply from it, thereby being able to forgive Saul for all that Saul had done. And if you want to find that secret river, if you want to know what it tastes like, and if you want to be healed, you must forgive, just like David forgave Saul. I know it's hard. It's the hardest thing in the world. But people can do it. Just in this past week, we've seen examples of people who have stooped down to drink from the river of mercy. This weekend, we have celebrated the 90th birthday of Nelson Mandela, who was in prison for 27 years. And when he stepped out of prison, he spoke up saying, "I forgive the people who imprisoned me. I call for mercy. I call for peace. I call for forgiveness." How can you do that when 27 years of your life has been destroyed? Or maybe you read in the KW record yesterday the story about that young man in Uganda, John Ochola, who was kidnapped by the rebel group called the Lord's Resistance Army, and they cut off his hands and they mutilated his face. But afterwards he said, I forgive them. I lift the burden of anger off of my shoulders and I set it down. I forgive them. Because I recognize that if I try to take revenge on them, then vengeance and hatred and bitterness will grow and be magnified again and again. And he forgave. That's what the river is all about. And we in the church are all about the cross of Calvary. And what the cross of Calvary is all about is God saying to us, no matter what you have done, I forgive you. And in the person of my Son, Jesus Christ, I give you mercy. I absolve you of all your crimes. That is the river. I said a moment ago that it wasn't about En-Gedi. It wasn't about that physical place, although the image of that oasis in the desert is beautiful. But maybe En-Gedi is significant. Maybe God chose En-Gedi because it was a freshwater spring right beside a massive body of dead, bitter water. And what God is saying to us at En-Gedi is this. In your life, you may choose, if you wish, to go down to that Dead Sea and drink of water that is bitter and that destroys and that will kill you. You can always go and dip your hands into the sea of bitterness and self-pity and hatred and vengeance. But if you would just take a couple of steps over, you would find a fresh spring. You would find your En-Gedi, life-giving water that will become within you as a fountain rushing out, giving life eternal to you. And once you drink it, you will never be thirsty again. I hope you will all discover David's secret river